This symposium was organized together with Alexa, and it is a joint venture with the Research Institute, the Getty Museum, and the UCLA Food Wood Center, as well as UCLA Humanities, for which I would also like to thank many people, including, obviously, the Humanities Division, its Dean, David Scaberg, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, but also foremost our colleagues at the Getty. Today, the first panel shall be introduced by my dear colleague, Professor Spear, Dr. Spear, who will be introducing the first panel on the Achaemenid exchanges with the Western world. Thank you so much.
At this point, it seems it should be clear that the theme is interconnections and an interdisciplinary approach to ancient history. This has been said by all of our speakers, and it is quite remarkable that the scholarly methodology has changed so much in recent generations, and I think in a very productive way. The three speakers this morning, the first session of the Achaemenid period, and I say the Achaemenid period, it seems we are shifting entirely to a Persian point of view, but all three of the speakers started as classicists, but have increasingly moved to an approach taking into consideration the vast information from the East. So I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn, and we'll hold the questions till the end of the session, but there will be time for questions, so keep them in mind. Robert Rollinger, one of the finest and most prolific ancient historians of our time, I believe, has since 2005 been a full professor in the Department of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Leopold Franzens Universität in Innsbruck. From 2011 to 2015, he was also a Finland Distinguished Professor in the Department of World Cultures, University of Helsinki, where he served as the research director of the Intellectual Heritage of the Ancient Near East project. His early work was on Herodotus and Greek historiography with a focus on intercultural contacts between East and West, but he has also broadly studied ancient Near Eastern history of the first millennium BC. And I really can think of no other scholar who draws on evidence from both Greek and Near Eastern sources, as Rahim was saying, so comprehensively to present a clear and compelling picture of intercultural relations. His intellectual and theoretical view is very broad as well, as he seeks to explore the nature of kingship and empire. Today's topic is Does the West Matter? The Persian Empire, Borders, and Ideology. Please welcome Robert Rollinger.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference, the institutions, the Getty and the Burda Wood, but especially Rahim and Alexa for organizing this wonderful conference. I would also like to thank Jeffrey for this very, very kind and polite introduction. So if you look at the topic of my talk, Does the West Matter? The Persian Empire, Borders and Ideology. So it is probably quite a different approach than you have been expecting. It will focus on the, let's say, on the deep connection between ideology, borders, and then moving forward to the West. And I will start with an introduction, mainly first focusing on ideological matters and then moving forward to the question of border and the West. As you can see, I have also prepared a handout because I'm mainly moving through a couple of texts which are regarded to be of major importance. I just start with a view on the map, so you can see the Persian Empire as it has been established by Cyrus the Great, and so you get somehow an overview on the geographical dimension of my talk. So let's start. Sometime after Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he commissioned an official text designed to legitimize his rule for a Babylonian audience and to present himself as a righteous and just king. This document was thoroughly conceptualized and written down in a Babylonian office or chancery in cuneiform and Babylonian language on clay tablets. We do not know how many copies of this master text were produced, but at least 2 small fragments survived, which have been kept at the British Museum since the end of the 19th century, but which were first identified in 2009 and 2010 especially by Finkel. Some of the master copies were transferred onto clay cylinders, which were used for various purposes. One of these cylinders was buried in the new constructions ordered by Babylon's conqueror. Although the text again and again underscores that Babylon was taken peacefully by Cyrus and his army, and this is confirmed by other cuneiform documents like, for example, the Nabonidus Chronicle, at least the city walls may have suffered some damage, which were repaired only 3 months after the conquest. A copy of one of these cylinder inscriptions survived. This is the famous Cyrus cylinder, which was found in 1879 in Babylon and most likely deposited in the foundations of the inner city wall Imgur Enlil, whose repair is described in the cylinder inscription as well. The Cyrus cylinder is the most prominent document of Cyrus' reign, and it is an important historical source. Since it provides testimony for how Cyrus wanted to present himself to a Babylonian audience, it is also a major document for the ideology of early Persian rule and the empire governed by the new elites. It thus perfectly testifies to Cyrus' vision of world rule and the world as such. After having described extensively how the reign of the Babylonian king Nabonidus and his crown prince Belshazzar negatively affected the people of Babylonia and the cult of the Babylonian gods, and how this blameful situation enraged Babylon's main deity Marduk, the text continues. So this is text number 1 on your handout. I have it also here on the screen, so I just read it. Marduk, to all the places whose dwelling places were in ruins, and to the inhabitants of Sumer and Akkad, who had become like corpses, he turned his mind, he became merciful. He searched through all the countries, examined them. He sought a just ruler to suit his heart. He took him by the hand. Cyrus, king of Anshan, he called for dominion over the totality. He named this name. Gutium and all the Uman Manda he made subject to him, the black-headed people whom he allowed his hands to overcome. He protected in justice and righteousness. Marduk, the great Lord, who cares for his people, looked with pleasure at his good deeds and his righteous heart. End of quote. Since the 3rd millennium BC, Babylonians were well aware that a just king is chosen by the head of the Babylonian pantheon to rule the country. But there is also something new with the cylinder inscription that the text underlines. The new king is chosen by a Babylonian deity, no longer in Babylonia proper, that is Sumer and Akkad, but outside, in foreign territory. The new king originates from the east, which is described in antiquated terminology as Gutium and as an area inhabited by the so-called Uman Manda, that is what we would call the Medes, a designation for the mainly Iranian population of the Zagros Mountains and further east. The new ruler is labeled as King of Anshan, which refers to a territory in southwestern Iran, where since the 2nd millennium BC, kings of Elam and Anshan held power. Already in the time of Cyrus' predecessor, Nabonidus, Marduk was regarded to have guided Cyrus. In 2 of Nabonidus' inscriptions, it is recorded that Marduk had elected Cyrus to overcome Ishtumegu, the Greek Astyages, king of the Medes. Thus, seen through a Babylonian lens, the Babylonian god was held responsible for Cyrus' ascent. In this way, his early success was acclaimed as a Babylonian success, which may have been a reply to the gradually growing feeling of endangerment aroused by the permanently ascending power in the East. The following passage in the Cyrus Cylinder can be understood as a direct answer to these fears, as well as a reinterpretation of Nabonidus' propaganda. To paraphrase, "Don't be afraid, Babylonians. Marduk has not only chosen Cyrus to be king of the East, but also of Babylonia proper, and as we will soon see, even as king of the world," which is of interest for our conference here. He did so because Nabonidus was a bad king, and Cyrus is a just one. As a proof of the crucial message paraphrased above, the inscription immediately underscores the fact that the city of Babylon was taken by Cyrus without any fighting. So this is text number 2 of the handout. Going to read it again. "He," that is Marduk, "ordered him," that is Cyrus, "to go to Babylon and let him take the road to Babylon. Like a friend and companion, he went by his side. His massive troops, whose number was immeasurable like the water of a river, marched with their arms at their side. Without battle and fighting, he let him enter the city of Babylon. He saved Babylon from its oppression. Nabonidus, the king who did not honor him, he handed over to him. All the inhabitants of Babylon, the whole of the land of Sumer and Akkad, princes and governors knelt before him, kissed his feet, rejoiced at his kingship. Their faces shone. The Lord, who through his help has brought the dead to life, who in a time of disaster and oppression has benefited all. Thus they joyfully celebrated him, honored his name." From other sources, such as the Nabonidus Chronicle, we know that there was some serious and heavy fighting at the city of Opis before Cyrus' troops could enter Babylon peacefully. The Cyrus Cylinder, however, conceals these events in order to enhance the implications of Marduk's divine benevolence towards Cyrus. And there is another point that deserves attention. Cyrus, the king from the east, has just become king of Sumer and Akkad, that is Babylonia. At line 20, the text changes perspective, and this is discernible in the accompanying shift from third to first person, which led Irving Finkel to dub the following lines the Cyrus proclamation. So, and this is text number 3 on your handout. I'm reading it again. "I, Cyrus, king of the universe, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters, son of Cambyses, great king, king of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus, great king, king of Anshan, descendant of Thespis, great king, king of Anshan, eternal seat of kingship, whose reign was loved by Baal and Nabu, and whose kingship they wanted to please their hearts. When I had entered Babylon peacefully, I set up with acclamation and rejoicing the seat of lordship in the palace. Marduk, the great lord, bestowed on me the destiny, his great heart, which loves Babylon. Daily I cared for his worship. My numerous troops marched peacefully through Babylon. I did not allow any troublemaker to arise in the whole land of Sumer and Akkad." End of quote. Apart from the firm emphasis on the peaceful conquest of Babylon, genealogy is introduced as a basic element of the king's self-representation. Tripartite or even longer genealogies have repeatedly been important features of Mesopotamian royal representation, although this was not the case with Cyrus' Neo-Babylonian predecessor. Nabopolassar, one of his predecessors, claimed to be son of a nobody. And Nabonidus could not refer to a royal lineage at all. By contrast, Cyrus is son, grandson, and descendant of great kings, who nonetheless, by their proper names and the reference to Anshan, betray their foreign background. Interestingly, in this part of the inscription, Cyrus himself is not characterized as king of Anshan as before in line 12, but with much more far-reaching royal titles. Now he is not only king of Babylon and king of Sumer and Akkad, but also king of the universe and king of the four quarters. Thus, beyond Babylonia and the east, suddenly a third spatial dimension arises, that hints at the claim of world dominion. But the genealogical as well as the spatial arguments for royal legitimization are crucial elements of Cyrus' self-representation. They are embedded within Mesopotamian tradition, although Nabonidus and his immediate predecessors did not, or I would say could not, develop the argument of a royal lineage. The claim of world dominion and royal genealogy are traditional strategies to legitimize rule and, in order to understand the specifics of each strategy of royal self-representation, it is crucial to explore the basic elements of both. Let us start with the genealogy. Cyrus mentions his father and grandfather as well as an ancestor. Notably, this ancestor is not Achaemenes, whom Darius later claims to be his ancestor. It cannot be ruled out that Darius and Cyrus, and thus their families, may have been somehow related, as in the case of the house of Valois, which was a cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty, and like nearly all European dynasties of the Middle Ages and the modern era, were somehow related. Nevertheless, descent and ancestry, and thus dynasty, are fundamentally social constructions of self-representation that are not established by a relationship based on DNA, but are rather constructed by focusing on specific branches of origin, real or forged. In his proclamation, Cyrus presents himself as a descendant of Thespis, not Achaemenes. In this regard, Cyrus is consistent with Mesopotamian tradition, where it was common to refer to an ancestor by his proper name. In comparison, Darius is exceptional because he introduces both a new ancestor, Achaemenes, and the family name, Achaemenids, although his genealogy does include a Thespis, who may or may not be identical with Cyrus' predecessor. All these Thespid predecessors are introduced as kings of Anshan, and here the spatial dimension mentioned above comes into play. As we know, space is also a mental construction that is organized not only from specific viewpoints, but also according to certain principles of structuring, thus establishing a mental map. This crucial aspect is sometimes ignored because ancient constructions of space are usually transferred to modern maps and thus objectified. And of course, we tend to ignore that our modern maps are constructions of space as well. As already mentioned, Anshan is a territory in southwestern Iran. It is a common feature of the Cyrus cylinder to use antiquated geographical terminology, as already mentioned, like Sumer and Akkad, Anshan, Gutium, and the like. It is nevertheless astonishing, at least from a modern viewpoint, that the term Parsa, that is modern Fars, does not occur at all. Apparently, Cyrus' self-perception is not a Persian or Iranian, but an Anshanite one. Against this backdrop, it is interesting to note that the etymological background of the names Cyrus, Cambyses, and Thespis is disputed in modern scholarship. Whereas Anshan, Sumer, and Akkad, as well as Babylon, refer to regions and a city that are more or less geographically fixed, the terms king of the universe and king of the four quarters are much more common and sweeping designations that generally refer to the world as a whole. These terms originate from Mesopotamian tradition, reaching back as far as the 3rd millennium, and became especially common when empires started to flourish in the 1st millennium BC. The claim for world dominion is also a construction which is characteristic for empires. In the same inscription, some lines below, this claim is refined. It reveals how Cyrus and his courtiers, I would say, conceptualized the newly conquered empire and its borders, that is, its reach and its dimension. So this is now text number 4 on your handout. Me, Cyrus, the king who worships him, that is Marduk, and Cambyses, my very own son, as well as all my troops, he, that is Marduk, blessed mercifully. In well-being we walk happily before him. At this great command all the kings who sit on thrones from all parts of the world, from the upper sea to the lower sea, who dwell in distant regions, all the kings of Amuru who dwell in tents, brought their heavy tribute to me and kissed my feet in Babylon. The passage starts with Marduk's blessing for Cyrus, his heir apparent as well as his troops. With the introduction of Cyrus' son Cambyses, who is later installed as king of Babylon, the text launches a progressive perspective of establishing a new dynasty, just as the genealogy discussed above presented a retrograde perspective of legitimization. With Cyrus and his son, world dominion comes into play, and this conception is now presented in a more elaborate way. Again, the world is encapsulated by terminology that is deeply rooted in Mesopotamian tradition. The upper sea, that is the Mediterranean, and the lower sea, that is the Persian Gulf, have been conceptualized as borders of the world since the kings of Agade of the 3rd millennium BC. However, the inscription develops this concept in more detail. Cyrus' sovereignty encompasses, I quote, all the kings who sit on thrones from all parts of the world, and all the kings of Amuru who dwell in tents. As a visible sign of their submission, they are supposed to yield heavy tribute to Cyrus and kiss his feet. Immediately a Babylon-centric worldview becomes apparent. For Cyrus does not reside in Anshan or somewhere else, but in Babylon. There are many examples of Neo-Babylonian inscriptions, especially of Nebuchadnezzar II, where the Babylonian king residing in Babylon receives tribute from the upper sea to the lower sea and from all of the lands. This Babylonian perspective becomes even more evident by the fact that in the cylinder's worldview, the East is eclipsed, whereas the West figures prominently with the all kings of Amuru who dwell in tents. With Amuru, the text once more uses an age-old expression for the West, imbued by the topical view that all people to the west of the river Euphrates practice a nomadic lifestyle. Taken together, all the kings of the world, so this is the civilized one, that is all the kings who sit on thrones, and the uncivilized ones, that is all kings of Amuru, acknowledge the world dominion of the king of Anshan residing in Babylon. When Darius I became king of the empire, so in 521 BC, conceptions of kingship and its representation changed remarkably. The king established a new dynasty and demonstrated a preference for new residences. In Nakhchi-Rustam, a new royal necropolis was established and new campaigns were launched to further expand the borders of the empire. With Xerxes' reign, expansion suddenly came to a halt. But the empire continued more or less successfully in the area from the river Indus to the Aegean until Alexander III, the Great, how we call him, brought it to an end. These developments affected the official view of the empire, royal representation, and spatial conceptions. Legitimization through genealogy was as important for Darius as it was for his successors, who all presented themselves as Achaemenids, whereas Darius also stressed his Aryan and Persian descent. Already in the Pisitun inscription, a further new element was introduced that figured prominently in the inscription of Darius and Xerxes, that is, lists of the peoples or countries, so the Persian term is Tachyu, in the plural Tachyava, that illustrate the dimensions of the Achaemenid Empire. The peoples or countries in these lists are not always the same, and the sequence of their presentation may also differ. As a common feature, the lists were introduced with a standard formula that hints to legitimacy of the king's rule, and his identity is always guided by Ahura Mazda, as an inscription of Darius from Persepolis illustrates. So this is text number 5 of your handout. I just quote it again, just as an example. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, these are the countries of which I took possession together with these Persian people. These feared me and brought me tribute: Elam, Media, Babylonia, Arabia, Assyria, Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Lydia, Greeks, that is Iauna of the mainland and those by the sea, and the countries beyond the sea, Sargatia, Parthia, Drangiana, Araya, Bactria, Sogdiana, Chorasmia, Satagudia, Arachosia, India, Gandhara, Scythians, Marca. So, end of the quote. What these lists present, together with the royal inscriptions, of which they are a part, is a mythical worldview. In this regard, it is significant that they do not talk about regular taxes, but about tribute, baji, in Old Persian. There are also no governors, administrators, or the like, but vassals, bandaka, by whom the great king rules his empire and to whom they owe obedience. Thus, the lists do not appear to represent provinces, but countries, people that visualize the Persian Achaemenid Empire and its place in the universe. In this mental map, the Persian land, that is Parsa, constitutes the center of the empire, immediately followed by neighboring lands like Media, Babylonia, and Elam. Parsa is introduced as a country that does not have to pay tribute at all, whereas Media, Babylonia, and Elam often begin the lists. The important royal residences are also located in these countries, from which the bulk of royal inscription originates as well. In one of these inscriptions, the so-called Susa Foundation Charter, Darius reports how his palace in Susa was built. What is special about this text is the fact that supposedly all peoples of the empire somehow participate in the construction work and make their specific skills available for the royal building. In an analogous manner, the construction materials are also yielded from all parts of the empire. In this way, the royal residence at the center of the empire becomes an image of the empire in its totality that is conceptualized as the world. It is therefore not surprising that the Achaemenid royal inscriptions do not indicate the presence of a world outside the empire and beyond the great king's reach. The central position of Parsa and the adjacent countries of Elam, Media, and Babylonia becomes apparent in inscriptions that focus on the borders of the empire. These borders are not fixed frontiers like those of modern states, but rather regions where the empire and the world appear to end. A good example of this conception is another inscription from Persepolis, Darius Persepolis H, 4 copies of which have survived. They represent trilingual texts, 2 on gold tablets, 2 on silver tablets, that were part of deposits of the Abadana of Persepolis, that is the magnificent reception hall where the great king used to receive delegations from all over the empire. So this is text number 6 of your handout. This is the kingdom which I behold, from the Saka who are beyond Sogdiana, from there as far as Kush, from the Indus as far as Sardis, which Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, bestowed upon me. End of quote. As Amélie Court put it, the mental map of this text exhibits the king looking out from the center towards the edges of the empire. In words, he draws lines running northeast to southwest, southeast to northwest, which intersect the imperial core. Thus, according to this inscription, the border areas of the Persian Achaemenid Empire are the lands of the Saka, we would say the Scythians, in the northeast, Kush, that is Ethiopia and Nubia, in the southwest, India in the southeast, and finally Sardis, that is Lydia, in the northwest. As we will see below, this border conception was not a stable one in Persian Achaemenid history. There were also other countries or peoples that could figure prominently at the outer and inner frontiers of the empire. The enumeration of lands and peoples was not limited to the lists in Darius Xerxes' inscriptions. They also occur in another form on monuments where each land or people was represented by a male figure with specific dress and in some cases weaponry and gifts. Some of these were added with figures who have labels in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite, and even Egyptian, which are important for the identification of each of these land and people. This is the case for Darius' tomb at Naqsh-e-Rustam and its perfect copy, the tomb of Artaxerxes III at Persepolis. Darius' tomb depicts 28 representatives of the different lands raising a throne platform on which Darius stands in front of a fire altar in a gesture of prayer towards Ahura Mazda. Two further representatives are giving further assistance by holding the feet of the platform from outside. It appears that all the peoples of the empire are carrying the great king on their hands, and that the king pays reverence to our master for the grace to which he owes his world-dominating kingship. All the other royal tombs at Nakshi Rustam and Persepolis share this representation, although they lack the accompanying labels. In an abbreviated form, these throne bearers also appear at the door jumps of the southern gates of the Palace of the 100 Columns at the central building at Persepolis. The most prominent depiction of this kind is the depiction of the 23 delegations of the different peoples' lands exhibited at the northern and eastern facade of the Apadana in Persepolis. In a symbolic way, they are yielding their land's characteristic products as tribute or gift to the king, represented in two grand reliefs, sitting on his throne and surrounded by his courtiers. For unknown reasons, the two reliefs with the king were exchanged by one of Darius' successors, but the delegations are still in their original location, flanking the staircases leading up to the great reception hall, offering their land's share to the great king. A special case is illustrated by the depictions of the people's countries originating from Egypt with additional labels in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The most prominent ones are those of the statue of Darius I, which is of Egyptian origin, but which was found in Susa. Other examples survived on the Tel El Maskuta canal stela that commemorates the course of the artificial canal commissioned by Darius connecting the river Nile with the Red Sea. As already mentioned, the mental map was not a stable one, but changed and was adapted over time. Whereas India, Hindush, in the east, and the land to the south of Egypt, that is Ethiopia, Nubia, Kusha, remained stable border markers, other coordinates of the imperial coordinate system were exchanged and adapted. Thus, for the land to the west of Egypt, the term Putaya, that we may translate as Libya, was introduced, which was already in use during Neo-Babylonian times. Changes are also visible at the eastern and western fringes of the empire. In both areas, differentiations of originally broader terms took place. This is best explained by the fact that a better knowledge of these regions led to the need and desire for specification. Notably, all these terms betray a Persian and thus Etic view on the edges of the empire. Let us start with the east. The term Saka, an Old Persian, was differentiated in Saka Haumavarga, Saka Digrachauda, and Saka Tayai Baradraya. The oppositions specify the Scythians according to customs, dress, and region. Haumavarga means hauma preparing and refers to the consumption or preparation of a plant drink with intoxicating effect. Digrachauda means wearing the pointed cap. A defeated representative of these Saka is depicted on the famous relief of Bisitun with the chief's Kunsha. The description of Saka Dayai Baradraya, the Scythians beyond the sea, is especially interesting in this context. It has always been a serious problem to identify this sea as encapsulated in this idea. The solution for this lies in the fact that these terms actually do not refer to real geography according to modern terms, but to mental maps and perception of the world belonging to the Achaemenid imperial agenda, which is in dialogue with ancient Near Eastern tradition. This becomes immediately evident when we look at the western fringes of the empire, where we encounter a similar conception. There is not the Lydians who mainly figure as frontier people, but rather the Yauna in Old Persian, Yaunab in Elamite, or Yamnaya in Babylonian, which are all terms that can be translated somehow as Greeks. These Yauna are differentiated again. Yauna Takabara, that is a difficult term to translate. Yauna Tayai Ushkachia, that is Greeks of the mainland. Yauna Tayai Trachiaya, that is Greeks who dwell in the sea. And Yauna Tayai Baradraya, Greeks who dwell beyond the sea. In analogy to the Scythians, the Yauna are specified by referring to regions and outward appearances, Takabara. Apparently, both peoples, Yauna and Saka, represent archetypical frontier people arranged in inverse order within the Achaemenid mental map. This fact is also underscored by the evidence originating from the rich corpus of Achaemenid seals, first appearing in the second half of Darius' reign and attested through the 5th and 4th centuries. There, apart from the Egyptians, only the Greeks and Scythians appear as identifiable peoples. Based on the evidence of the royal inscriptions, these peoples are part of the empire ruled by the great king according to the principle of a Pax Achaemenidica, acting as king of countries containing all kinds of men, or king on this great earth far and wide, or king on the entire earth. So these are all titles. On the seals, however, these peoples are permanently overthrown by the great king. The seemingly contradictory nature of these two kinds of representation betrays the multiple and mixed functions of the Achaemenid mental map in that it does not represent reality, but conveys an ideologically based worldview. On the one hand, the Achaemenid Empire represents the world and is perceived through the lens of a person-centric perception of the world. On the other hand, the elites from whom the seals originate were eager to demonstrate their bravery and heroism in battle and strife to the great king and performed heroic deeds in a paradigmatic fashion at the fringes of the empire. But what does the designation beyond the sea as reference of the localization of specific Yauna and Saka mean in this context? In attempting to answer this question, ideology and world perception interferes with real geography. Focusing on the Yauna only, one could argue that the Yauna beyond the sea represent those people of the Aegean or Sea of Marmara that were, at least for some time, part of the empire, and that this designation thus reflects real geography. But this is not really convincing, as the difficulties exhibit that modern scholarship has with precisely identifying these different Yauna, and the disagreement reveals expressed in this context. The positioning of these peoples in the inscriptions is too vague for exact localization. What matters is the meaning of the phrase beyond the sea. And this can only be decoded if we interpret the terminology in dialogue with ancient Near Eastern traditions. As we have already seen, since the 3rd millennium, the imperial agenda of ancient Eastern empires claimed world dominion from the upper to the lower sea. That is, the sea was the border of the world, and thus the border of the empire. With the empire of Agade in the 3rd millennium, there was already an expansion of this concept. When King Manish-Tushu claimed to have been victorious over, I quote from an inscription, the cities across the sea. The kings of Agade played a prominent role all over ancient Near Eastern history as archetypical empire builders, and this is especially true for the empires of the 1st millennium, including the Persian one. It was in particular in the 1st millennium that empires were keen to demonstrate their individual achievements by claiming to have transgressed the borders of the sea. So from times of Sargon II in the end of the 8th century BC onwards, this was demonstrated in particular by referring to islands or regions, I quote from some inscriptions, in the midst of the sea, that were supposedly under the Assyrian king's control. This is also true for the Neo-Babylonian Persian kings. Darius took up this concept and developed it further to demonstrate how outstanding his world dominion was, and this is precisely what Bharadraya terminology refers to. In contrast to their Neo-Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian predecessors, the Persian kings do not only claim to have controlled regions beyond the sea in the west, but also in the east. Only with this information in mind does the following passage in Darius' Bisitun inscription, which has long puzzled modern scholars who were trying to harmonize the text's information with real geography, make sense. So this is the last text, text number 7. You have it on the handout. Afterwards, I went off with an army against Scythia, against the Saka. After that, the Saka who we appointed came against me. When I had reached the sea by means of a tree trunk, this is not in the text but replaced, with the whole army I crossed it. Afterwards I defeated the Saka utterly. Another part I took captive, which was led to me in feathers, and he who was their chief, called Skuncha, him they took prisoner, led to me in fetters. There I made another their chief, as was my desire. After that, the country became mine. End of quote. The suggested supplement in the break by means of a tree trunk, which has no foundation in the text, only makes sense if one ignores that the text's major statement, that is, that Darius and his army crossed the sea, Old Persian Draya, and interprets this sea as river, identifying it with the Amur Darya. However, we are again dealing with a mental map, where world perception and claim of world dominion are the parameters for interpretation. In this light, the message of the inscription is clear and simple. Darius is the first king in history who really ruled the world by controlling in east and west areas beyond the sea that were out of reach of any of his predecessors. This claim also becomes evident in another of Darius' inscriptions that is only preserved in a Babylonian version. In this text, Ahura Mazda bestows on Darius, I quote, the kingship over this wide earth, in which there are many lands, Persia, Media, and the other lands of other tongues, of mountains and plains, from this side of the sea to that side of the sea, from this side of the desert to that side of the desert, end of quote. Like his Neo-Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian predecessors, Darius ruled over all conceivable landscapes, including deserts and mountains. But this time, the absolute fringes of the world have been reached. This included the Yauna as well as the Saka beyond the sea. Persian rule was outstanding, and the Persian Empire could not be compared with any preceding empire. Returning to the leading question of my talk, does the West matter? The answer is multi-layered. It depends on the definition of center and periphery, perspective and worldview. If we focus on the indigenous sources, as this paper has hopefully demonstrated, the West cannot claim to have received any higher value than other parts of the empire. The story is, however, entirely different if we focus on sources from the periphery, as it has been mainly done the last 2,400 years. This is the master narrative of the Greco-Persian Wars. But this is another story. Thank you for your attention.